All right, so let's talk about the Moabites for a second, okay? The best way to relate the Moabites to us today are to the Samaritans in the New Testament, okay? We're all aware of the Samaritans, the story of the Great Samaritan that Jesus tells. Did the Israelites like the Samaritans? When they heard the story, no, they didn't. When they heard the story of the Great Samaritans, they looked down on the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a half-breed people. They did not like them. The Israelites looked at the Moabites in the Old Testament very, very similar to the Samaritans in the New Testament. Okay? The Moabites literally started from Abraham's cousin named Lot. His daughters had sex with him, and from that became a few different people, and one of those people was Moab, who became the Moabite people. And so these people are looked down upon. It says Ruth the Moabite over and over again in the story, and it points it out on purpose, because every time they do that, it's a put down. It'd be like the New Testament saying John the Samaritan. Okay? It'd be like adding something to the end of somebody's name who makes them hated by people immediately. It'd be like Marcus the terrorist today. To go, it's that extreme, where you hear it and it combines the name with the identity, and people just hate them and don't like them. It's the same thing here for Ruth. Okay, so this is where Ruth comes from. This is where her people come from, and so it said she comes with Ruth the Moabite. Okay, and note that Naomi is very downtrodden. Okay, she says she went away full and I come back empty. Okay, she left the nation of God where she was supposed to be empty and now has come back, or she left full and now has come back empty. Okay, so we come to chapter 2. What chapter 2 happens is at the very end of chapter 1 it says they're at the time of the barley harvest. So what's happening is they are harvesting the fields. Okay, and one of the laws that God has set forth for unwed women, widows, is when you go and when you harvest the field, okay, when you pick something off a tree, if something falls down along with it, you leave it on the ground. Okay? So they go around, they're gathering stuff off, plants, and anything that falls to the ground, they leave to the ground. What happens is the widows come behind them, and that's their food. Okay, it's something that God set up for the Israelite people to provide for those who couldn't provide for themselves. So what happens is Ruth goes and she does this. Okay, she goes out to a field, and you see in verse 7 of chapter 2, she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So she goes out early in the morning to the field and says, "Can I glean or can I harvest after you're harvesting?" Because you're grabbing stuff and stuff is going to fall to the ground naturally, and that's what she's going to pick up. And then we see Boaz. Okay, and in verse 8 it says, "Then Boaz said to Ruth, 'Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Lay your eyes beyond the field that they are reaping and go after them.'" And so what Boaz does is she goes to his field, and he is very generous and very kind and very loving to her, and allows her to go and to glean and to get food. So she works, and notice she's there from the early morning. Okay, she's a hard worker. Ruth is. We see that here. Okay. And then go down to verse 14. And it says, "At mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come here, eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine.' And so she sat beside the reapers, and he passed her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, 'Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her, but also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her.' So she gleaned in the field until evening." Okay, and so it says that Boaz was providing more for her. He was over and abundant and generous, saying, "Take some of what we have picked and let her essentially have it." Okay, And so it says here that Boaz worked from the early morning, she worked all day with a short break at lunch, and then she worked the rest of the day. Okay? Ruth is a very, very hard worker. And so and then chapter 2 ends, and we go to chapter 3. And at the end of chapter 2, what happens is Ruth goes home and tells Naomi what happens. And Naomi figures out that Boaz is a distant relative of Elimelech. And so something we're going to talk about here in a minute is that distant relatives of dead people can... Actually, let's just talk about it right now. There's something in the Bible called a kinsman redeemer. Okay? This is something else that God set up. I shouldn't have erased that. It's okay. A kinsman redeemer. And so what God set up was... Actually, let's go ahead and read it. Deuteronomy chapter 25. This is found in... Deuteronomy chapter 25. Okay. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy chapter 25. Okay? And so let me read along with me verses 5 through 10. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel, so he will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him, and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then the brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, and pull off his sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. And she shall answer him, say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called Israel, the Lord who has pulled his sandal off. So what God has set up, that's within this story of Ruth, is that if somebody dies, let's say my brother dies and he has no kids with his wife, okay, which is what happened, okay. Mahlon dies, Ruth does not have an heir from him, therefore his lineage would die with her if she does not remarry and have a kid. So what happens is Chilon should have came and took that, and they should have had a kid together, which would have continued Mahlon's lineage, but he died as well. So they go back to Israel, and it just so happens that she goes and gleans and harvests in the one field of a distant relative. Because after a brother, it becomes the next closest relative. And Naomi knows that Boaz is a distant relative of Elimelech, which would continue his lineage. And so in the portion of the movie love scene where this is at, this is where the girl randomly goes into the coffee shop or the store and works, where a distant somebody could come and be her husband. Okay? This is the point of the story where you realize later, like, oh, that just happened to happen. You know what I'm saying? Like, it just happens to happen, but it's God leading it to happen. Okay? And so Ruth goes and says, I gleaned in Boaz's field, and then Naomi's like, oh, that's a distant relative. That's someone who could be a kinsman redeemer, as God set up. And so what happens is in chapter 3 of Ruth, we won't read any of it because it's long and in detail, but what happens essentially is Ruth goes to where Boaz is sleeping, and she's very, very brave and courageous, and she goes and she lays at his feet. And it's a sign of, I want to be your wife kind of thing, kind of situation. And so what happens is that's just a custom that happened, and so she goes, and Boaz essentially says, yes, I will take you. And at the end of chapter 3, he is very, very gracious and generous with her again, as he gives her more food as she leaves in the morning. Okay, and so we see this love story growing and building. And then we come to chapter 4. Okay, so at this point in chapter 4, Boaz wants to marry Ruth the Moabite. Okay, but Boaz knows there's a closer relative than him. Okay, so it just goes brother and the next closest relative and the next closest relative and so on and so forth. So Boaz is the second closest. So they got to go talk to another guy because he technically would be the closer kinsman redeemer. So chapter 4, Boaz is going to go talk to this guy. So read on with me, Ruth chapter 4, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. So let's pause here and let's chat. We see here that Boaz went up to the gate. He's showing that he's a man who gets things done. Okay, he went up early in the morning. He waited at the gate because he knew this guy would come. The city gates in Israel at this time, think of them as a modern day coffee shop. Okay, people come for work meetings. They go to do homework. They go to just socialize. A lot of things. A lot of people are coming in, going out, doing things. A lot of stuff's happening at once. Okay, this is what the city gates was. Essentially a town hall. Okay, people coming and going, doing business and work and all this stuff. And so the city gates were a very popular, very happening place with many different activities going on. And so, interesting how, follow this line of think with me. Boaz knows there's a closer redeemer. He knows this guy. Okay, he's in his family. But look how he addresses him here. He says, Boaz said, turn aside, friend, and sit down. He doesn't give him a name. And the rest of these verses, you'll see this redeemer doesn't have a name. And in the Hebrew, this word friend literally means so-and-so. And so he says, turn aside so-and-so and sit with me.